Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you guys here today. Hi, Bill. Hope you guys are all having a good Thursday so far. Or sorry, wow, Wednesday. It is only Wednesday. It's okay. While we're waiting, if you guys can, please remember to update your name on Zoom to include your name and your organization. That's always really helpful for us. And we'll just give it a couple minutes till everyone arrives, and then we'll go ahead and dive in. All right, we've got a couple more people just trickling in, so we'll probably give it one more minute before we dive in. Thanks everyone for your patience. Okay, and with the recording in progress, I think that's a good sign. Crystal, shall we kick it off?
We're good to go.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. It's so good to see you guys. Thanks for being here and welcome to our Building Performance Standard Task Force meeting number 10. We are closing in on the end of this task force and just really appreciate all of you guys' time and for being here today. So before we dive in, if everybody can please remember to update the Zoom name that you've got in your box. You do that by hovering over the little 3 dots in the top right corner, go down to rename, and then throw your name and your organization's name in there. Just helps us for note taking and attendance taking. Okay, so you guys have seen these meeting norms, but we'll just quickly review them. As you can, please make sure your Zoom cameras are on and you are muted when you're not talking. Remember, there are no bad ideas in this space, and feel free to speak freely. All ideas will be considered. Share your thoughts in this space with each other and be respectful. Be present. As always, if you can limit phone and email use during this meeting, it makes for a much more productive conversation. Remember, you're here to leverage your expertise and not your connections. And as a reminder for that new meeting norm we added a couple of meetings ago, enough, let's move on. Just a reminder to avoid rabbit holes since we have rabbit hole discussions, since we have a lot to cover per usual at these meetings, and it helps keep us on task. So our goals and outcomes, why we're here today, we're here to make sure that the building performance standard recommendations are equitable and contribute to a low carbon and clean energy future. Our overarching greenhouse gas goal is to reduce building sector-wide emissions 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. And then we're here to develop recommendations that will reduce that greenhouse gas pollution, lower energy costs, and improve indoor air quality in the state. Our guiding goals, again, these will be incorporated into our recommendations. Well, not the truncated versions that you're seeing here, but the full guiding goals that you guys voted on early in the process. But just a reminder for the equity, workforce, reliability, costs, engaged and informed community, and streamlined goals that we discussed at the beginning. And keep those in mind through our discussion today. Again, you've seen all these slides, so I just feel like a robot repeating some of this, but our building performance standard timeline is on the slide. So our recommendations will be finalized and delivered to the CEO, Director, Governor, and General Assembly and AQCC on October 1st. And then the AQCC will make those rules final and official on June 1st, 2023. And then we have until 2027 when that first compliance is due. And that's for the year 2026. So at the last meeting, at the last task force meeting, we spent a good chunk of time discussing and voting on the the compliance adjustment proposals. So we voted on final language for the target adjustment proposal and the timeline adjustment proposal. And then we also took a look at the visual matrix that you guys might recall that sort of shows the pathways for earning compliance and how you navigate through what earns compliance and what earns partial compliance. And then we discussed programs to support compliance, workforce, and equity. Moving from meeting 9 into meeting 9A, the optional meeting, and thank you for those who are able to attend. We were able to spend a lot more time diving into a discussion around the programs to support compliance, equity recommendations, and workforce recommendations. And so all of that really great input that you guys gave us at meeting 9 and meeting 9A on those 3 areas, programs, equity, and workforce, we've sort of synthesized all that, and we'll bring that forward for sort of final discussion and vote today. So as far as things that we've finalized and made decisions and progress on as a task force, we've decided on the metric and how we're going to set our targets. We've recommended our compliance pathways and our adjusted compliance pathways. And the things that we still need to finalize in the time that we have left together is our recommendation for programs supporting compliance, workforce and equity considerations, and then a couple of pieces that we are actually going to pull into the meeting today that have been touched on or mentioned in past meetings. 1 or 2 of them will be new, and we'll talk about those after the break today. But we need to decide on the principles for demand flexibility that if we do want to consider those as part of our recommendation for the building performance standard. And then we need to think through and discuss recommendations around civil penalties and a couple of other new proposals and that you guys saw in the pre-work and we'll discuss in a little bit. So how that all flows into today's agenda. After I'm done kicking us off, I will go through, our team has spent some time figuring out our, excuse me, how we're gonna get from June 29th to that October 1st deadline and how the review process is gonna look in between. And I sent a little teaser about this in the email that I shared with you guys with the pre-work, but we'll cover that in a lot more detail and see if you guys have any questions or thoughts for us to consider there. And then we will move on to talking about and finalizing our programs. Oh, excuse me, I skipped a piece. Then we're going to hear from our very own Tracy Phillips and then Delynn from the Energy Office, who will be sharing 2 existing programs in the state of Colorado that can support building owners in earning compliance with the building performance standard. And so that will hopefully tee up for our discussion on programs for supporting compliance. A little bit of background for you guys on what's already existing, so we can incorporate that and think about that as we move that recommendation forward. Then we'll cover equity and workforce in the building performance standard, again, drawing from what we heard from you guys from our last 2 meetings. We'll take a break at about 2:25. And then after that, we'll go through those new proposals that we shared with you guys as pre-work. And then we'll wrap up right before 3:30. All right, so let me start, I guess, let's dive into the timeline. So again, we wanted to make sure, I guess, responding to some feedback we heard in the optional meeting, and are putting this timeline together, we wanted to make sure that everyone in this task force has a chance to review the final recommendation document language. We think it's really important that if you guys are going to be signing your name off on something, that you all feel that you can support what's being written and that you have a chance to fully read and review it before it's getting finalized. So today is June 29th, that first meeting there, and we're talking about workforce equity programs, as well as a few other proposals we're hoping to finalize. We are going to go ahead and cancel the optional meeting that was meant for July 13th. At that meeting, we were planning to discuss the public feedback that we got from those public outreach meetings. And since those have shifted back into July, we won't have that information by that time. So our new plan is we're going to delete that optional meeting, which should be removed from your calendars at this point. And at our July 27th meeting, we're going to spend that time talking about the public input that we received via the survey and via the 3 public meetings in July. And as we go through that, we'll gauge from the task force, do we want to change or adjust any of our recommendations based on that public feedback? So that'll really be our opportunity to hear what the public's saying and react to it. So then after that meeting, Lotus and CEO will work on developing I'll call it the final draft language of our recommendations. And those will be sent to you guys on August 10th. So each one of you guys will get an individual copy of that. We'll ask that you save it, you include your comments, and we'll include more instructions on sort of how to conduct your review so that it makes it easy to synthesize on our end. And you'll have a week and a half. So we'll send it to you on Wednesday. You'll have till the following Friday to give us any of your initial feedback on the final recommendation document. Once we receive that, we'll combine all of your feedback. We'll make updates to the final recommendations document, and then we will send that to you 1 week ahead of our final meeting. So at the September 7th, you guys will get that recommendations document with all of your feedback included. And then this is the new thing to add to our sort of schedule, is we're adding a 12th task force meeting that is going to be Wednesday, September 14th, the same time, 1 to 3:30 p.m. And this will be the chance for you all to come together and discuss that final recommendations document that we'll have shared with you on September 7th. So if there's any final thoughts, comments, notes, whatever that you guys want to, or items that you guys need to discuss together before it's the final sign off and send to the CEO director, then that's when we'll cover those conversations. And then it'll all be wrapped up by the end of September.
I'll just chime in really quickly, just
Please.
to say that the Energy Office is grateful for the task force for providing us more feedback on how we should do the recommendation review process. So thank you for everyone who provided us feedback on that. And also, we understand that this is voluntary. It was hard to actually schedule that September meeting. We know that we told you guys you only had to meet until July, but in order to have more time to review the recommendations, that was the most opportune time that we could schedule that meeting. So I apologize that we're adding meetings to the schedule, but it's the only solution to give us more time. But if you have any comments or questions about this, please let Kim or I know at this point.
Yeah, and just responding to Kara's chat, you're welcome, of course. I'm glad we were able to fit this into the schedule. We felt that it was very important. So any questions on the new timeline? All make sense? Cool. And we'll send this out. You guys will have this schedule in the meeting materials, so you can reference it again, but we'll continue to remind you guys as these timelines go out and what the deadlines for review are once we send out that recommendations document. All right. Well, with that, we are going to move on to a presentation from Delyn and from Tracy, and I'm going to pass it to Tracy first to talk about the current financial programs for building owners in the state of Colorado. And just a quick reminder for our team, I'm just going to pull up our agenda so I make sure I've got the timing on here. Please make sure to keep the presentation brief because we have 25 minutes total for this, and we want to make sure we have plenty of time to discuss the proposals. So Tracy, I will pass it to you, and just let me know when you want me to advance the slide.
All right, sounds good. Let's go. Oh, how about those Colorado Avalanche? Just want to say that first. All right. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about a financing program. Probably a lot of you are aware of. That's available to building owners across the state. And it's called the Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, or CPACE for short. You can go to the next slide. So the program was launched in 2016 and was designed to help finance energy efficiency, renewable energy, and water conservation improvement projects. I won't talk about new construction, but it's also available for new construction projects as well. So the program is, as I mentioned, a statewide program. When the legislation was passed, it created a district. We call it the New Energy Improvement District. Counties need to opt into the program before we can finance projects in that county, and I have a slide on that. And all of the financing is provided through private capital. So there's no federal money or state money or grants or bonds. This is all privately financed through banks and credit unions and other financial organizations. You can go to the next slide. So the fundamentals of the financing, it was designed to give owners a different way of financing these types of improvement projects. And there's three fundamental pieces to it that make it different than other forms of financing. So the first is it's 100% financing. It'll cover all the hard costs and all the soft costs and anything related to these improvement projects. The second is it's long-term, so you can finance a project up to 25 years. So think of a traditional loan, usually 20% out of pocket, finance it over 5 years. This is nothing out of pocket, finance it over 25 years. So it could be much more attractive to owners financially in terms of the effect on their net operating income. The third piece that really makes it different from other forms of financing, it's a special assessment that gets placed on the property. So buildings have assessments placed on them all the time, sewer assessments, sidewalk assessments. This works the same way. And the idea behind this is that as an assessment, it rides with the property. So if an owner sells the building, they have the ability to hand off the payment obligation to the next owner. So that, again, can be compelling because if something has a long return on investment, it may not be interested in financing it if they're going to sell the building soon. But if they can hand off the payment obligation, then they are much more likely to do those types of improvements. Next slide, please. So what's eligible? So the C and CPACE is for commercial. So any commercial, industrial, or agricultural building is eligible for financing. That includes nonprofits, even though they don't pay property taxes. They can have assessments placed on them just like everybody else. So that's fine. Multifamily, if it's 5 or more units, it's considered commercial multifamily. So things like apartment complex or low income housing are absolutely eligible for financing. And then the overarching criteria is anything that reduces their utility bill is eligible. So all the things you would normally think of, heating and cooling, lighting, controls, any envelope improvement like roof replacement, new windows, elevator modernization, can really be anything that reduces their utility bill, including water, of course. So low flow plumbing, I've seen a lot of, even smart irrigation systems. Okay, next slide. So not only are the improvements eligible, but anything related to those improvements. So if they have to do architectural design work or engineering design or an energy audit, and any hard costs related to the improvements as well. So asbestos abatement, related to a new boiler, structural upgrades to support a new solar PV system, electrical upgrades to support a new lighting system. Anything related to the improvements is also eligible to be rolled into the financing. Next slide. So I mentioned it's a statewide program. Each county has to opt in. I've been traveling all over the state for the last 6 years, and we have 40 counties on board. So this actually represents 96% of the building stock is in a county that is eligible for financing. So we have some pretty good coverage, and I'm still working to get the rest. I'm not gonna go back to sleep until I get all 64 on board, but we've made really good progress. So most of the major counties, minor counties, rural counties are all in the program. Next slide, please. So here's what the program has done to date. We finance 102 projects, a little over 160 million. Project sizes will range. 60,000 is about as small as we have gone. The biggest we've done so far is a $29.7 million project in Boulder. I'm actually working on a $55 million deal that should close in July. So the sky's the limit. You cannot have a project too big for CPACE. There's tons of money that wants to invest in these projects. The challenge is not getting the money. The challenge is getting the projects developed. So this is why I think the CPACE program could really be a great resource for a lot of these building owners, you know, to do these types of upgrades. We've got 272 registered contractors, and that's growing all the time as well. So that's another great resource for building owners if they're looking for, you know, a certain discipline and who to work with. And we have 45 capital providers. That's where all the money's coming from, different banks, credit unions, other financial organizations. So like I said, the financing community desperately wants to invest in these types of improvements. I just need the projects. So next slide. I think that's it. So that's me, and I'm ready to help Colorado.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Way to get cranked through that so quickly. That was impressive. And yeah, would love to see if there are any questions. Paul, I see you've got one. I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. Good to hear an overview like that of CPACE. We've looked at it a few times, but not gone ahead. Tell me about the registered contractors issue. Does a contractor have to be registered prior to submitting to participate? And I assume this is for installation as opposed to design, but go ahead.
Yeah, so what we mean by registered contractor is they're just registered with the CPACE program, and it's just a demonstration that they have some understanding of how the CPACE financing works. A contractor does not need to be registered to work on a project necessarily. I just need one registered contractor involved with the project. And if I have a project where none of them are registered, I'll get one registered. So that's never been a problem.
Awesome. And Christine?
What are the main reasons a building owner wouldn't use CPACE financing besides just frankly not knowing about it?
Yeah, well, it's an option, right? It's like, you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but there's a lot of different tools out there. So a traditional loan might be a better option for them. They might be able to get a grant for the work they want to do. They might just want to pay out of pocket for some projects. So yeah, it's just one resource that, you know, it is long-term financing. So you're paying more in interest, right? So that's sort of a trade-off. So they have to balance that. They say, you know, but then again, even if they have the money, maybe that money's better spent somewhere else in their business, and maybe financing it is better. So there are a number of different variables that come into play. And I don't try to just pound CPACE into somebody's throat. I just, you know, offer it as an option. We'll even usually show them different options. Here's the CPACE versus a bank loan. And, you know, the bank loan might be a better fit for them.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. We'll go to Jim and then John. And then if you guys have any other questions, I'll ask that you drop them in the chat so we can hear from Dylan. So Jim?
Yeah, building on what Christine said, we actually were talking to Tracy 5 years ago on a project. Remember that Fruitdale School building in Wheat Ridge, Tracy?
Yeah.
And we had this really weird wrinkle in state law that our attorney found because it was a low-income housing deal. And there's a piece of state law that says that the property tax abatement, which low-income housing wants, means you can't have any assessments on the parcel. And since CPACE pays their loan back with assessments, we were not able to get a CPACE loan. And I would just question to you, Tracy, has there been any discussions with state legislators about changing that little wrinkle in state law? Or if not, maybe there could be?
Yeah, the Energy Office can correct me, but they actually initiated legislation that got passed, I want to say 1.5 years ago. So that they made an exception just for CPACE. So CPACE can be used for those types of properties now.
Oh, perfect. Thanks for acting on that.
Well, it was all the Energy Office. I had nothing to do with it. I'm not a legislator.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. And then John.
I was involved in a large CPACE project, and I just, from a commercial standpoint, because that's what I'm in, one of the biggest hurdles was, you have to watch how your leases are written, whereas capital projects and even some assessments in leases, it might say that they're not responsible for them as the tenant is paying them back. So that's a hurdle we had to get through, at least from our standpoint. And I know one big lease, we were only able to assess them the amount of energy we saved, or the dollars that we saved, basically. So just from the commercial side, that's what I had dealt with.
Yeah, and I will say, yeah, that's true. There are details that need to be worked out with different lease agreements. There are CPACE project developers that have experience in sort of helping to negotiate those types of terms. The nice thing about CPACE is it gives you that ability to, pass along the payment obligation to a tenant. Whereas if an owner finances it themselves, it's all on them. So, it's nice to sort of have that problem of, all right, now how do I apply it to the tenants, as opposed to not being able to do it at all. So, but yeah, there are details that need to get worked out. I've never worked on a simple project. Every project has certain nuances.
Awesome. Well, thanks, John. And thanks again, Tracy, for that awesome overview. If anyone else has any questions for Tracy, please drop them in the chat. And then Tracy, if you want to keep an eye on that, or I can point them out to you as well, we'll get those answered. So next I'm going to call on Delyn, and I will pass it to you to talk about energy performance contracting.
All right, thanks, Kimberly. I'm Delyn Southern. I'm a technical specialist here at the Energy Office. I provide technical contract support for public energy projects. So today I'm going to talk about one of our existing programs, which is the Energy Performance. And then I'll spend a couple minutes at the end just covering some of the new initiatives that will be kicking off next fiscal year, and that will support, building upgrades and energy improvements. Slide. Okay, to start off, energy performance contracting, or EPC as we call it, is a financing and contracting tool that statutorily enables jurisdictions to use cost savings from energy improvements to actually repay the project over time. So this is one of the Energy Office's longest standing programs. We've been operating for just over 25 years now. And since then, public buildings have achieved over 240 million kWh in first year energy savings, and have also realized over $45 million in annual cost savings. So the statute here in Colorado does require a couple of things to be true about an energy performance contract. So one of those is it has to be cash flow positive. This is in response to Tabor. Another thing is the payback of the project has to be shorter than the lifetime of the equipment. That means you're not going to be paying for new equipment that's reached its end of life. The third thing is we do require 3 years of measurement and verification. This is kind of our checks and balances phase of the process. And then lastly, all of our projects include what we call a guaranteed utility cost savings. That means that whatever the energy service company or ESCO says that you will save by implementing certain measures, you'll have to save those. Otherwise, they essentially need to write you a check. So that extra guaranteed does, provide a lot of surety within our projects, makes them very attractive to lenders and things like that. Slide. All right, so in Colorado, we operate the EPC program as a public-private partnership. So you'll see our office there serves as that program administration role. We also provide template documents and contracts, as well as staffed engineering support to review any of the project recommendations. Our clients are Colorado's public jurisdiction. So these are your cities, counties, state agencies, universities, K through 12 school districts, as well as special districts. And then lastly, that private sector support comes from our program qualified energy service companies, or ESCOs. And in addition to that, we have an active financier and lender pool within Colorado. Slide. Okay, so this chart is just showing how an energy performance contract works. As I mentioned earlier, EPC uses savings identified from an energy audit to pay for any capital improvements over a period of time. So that first column you see is your current operating expense or budget. You'll notice there's a little box at the top there. These are areas where improvements could be made to improve efficiencies and lower costs. Using our program, an ESCO evaluates your facilities and helps you identify any improvements that would generate savings. They put together what we call an investment grade audit report and a proposal, which includes project costs, savings, financing, and any grants or incentives. I think an important thing to note is often these identified savings can actually be used as grant match dollars. So our program works pretty closely with the Department of Local Affairs grants, as well as a number of grants from the CDE BEST program for K through 12 schools. That third column shows how the identified savings are used as repayment. And then finally, after the project has been paid for, the public jurisdiction would just benefit from reduced operating costs, as well as that added bonus of having brand new equipment and technology. Slide. All right, so a major component of an EPC project is that investment grade audit, which defines the scope of work. I won't get too into this right now, but look at each of these circles on this slide. These are milestones where our office is present with both the client, the private sector partner, in order to evaluate that audit progress and to provide any additional technical review of all the recommendations. We make sure that the proposal and the deliverables satisfy budgetary requirements of the public jurisdiction. We make sure that it meets timeline expectations, as well as that it's considering a holistic approach towards energy upgrades and helps the community achieve any of their sustainability or climate action plan goals. Next slide. All right, so to explain it a bit further, here we see that traditional facilities improvement approach. Typically that involves, quick fixes, using existing technology. That piecemeal approach requires, budget requests, voter approval, things like that. The EPC approach instead looks at facilities comprehensively and ensures a couple of things. So the first is it makes sure systems are working together and efficiently. It allows for technology transition and new equipment. And then lastly, by using the savings as payment, it means that you can operate within that existing budget and ultimately kind of puts you on that path to supporting those, broader climate goals. So kind of like instead of putting like a Band-Aid on your buildings, you're able to improve your facilities for the future, which I think is a great benefit of this program. All right, slide. So to sum it up here, just some of the main benefits of the EPC program. First, it provides a single procurement contract. So instead of communities having to coordinate in-house with multiple subcontractors, our program qualified ESCOs kind of serve as that general contractor role. Next, by statute, it is required to be cash flow positive. This makes EPC contracts TABOR compliant. Next, all energy maintenance cost savings are guaranteed. projects also promote that local workforce and economic development. Often our ESCOs will source any subcontractors within their communities, whenever that's requested or if it's feasible for the project. And then finally, all of our communities receive no cost support from the Colorado Energy Office, which includes, standardized state-approved documents, access to a pool of program qualified ESCOs, as well as that free engineering support throughout the life cycle of the project. Okay, slide. Okay, so switching gears just a little bit, we did have a busy legislative session with some big wins. I'm just going to review a couple of them today. I do want to make a note that we are still creating these offerings and kind of assessing our staffing requirements. So we do hope to have these publicized with kind of a launch plan within the next 3 to 6 months. So the first on this list is Building Electrification for Public Building Grant Program. I'm going to give a big shout out to Keith Hay, who's on the call today. He really helped push all of these, through that finish line. So we appreciate his efforts. But essentially, this is a grant offering. Our office is developing policies and procedures right now and plans to offer a total of $10 million for public buildings to install equipment that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Next, kind of a similar offering is the High Efficiency Electric Heating and Appliances Grant Program. So here we have $11 million total to support neighborhood scale electrification projects. I will point out on both of these grant offerings, we've earmarked around 30% of that funding to go towards LMI, DI, or just transition communities, which was a great piece of legislation to come out around these grants. And then lastly, our office will roll out a geothermal grant program with $20 million in funding to support geothermal projects across the state. So that's all I have on new programs. I know Michael Turner's on the phone and I'll give him a chance to throw out anything else if he'd like. Otherwise, happy to answer questions.
Nothing to add here, Dylan. Thanks for the overview.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Dylan, for that great overview of EPC and the new programs that are coming down the pipeline. Does anyone have any questions for Dylan? Paul, go for it.
Hey, thanks, Dylan. You mentioned early in your slide deck a grant match. Could you explain that a little bit more? I didn't quite catch how that worked.
Yep. So some of the grant programs offered at the state level, they have a component. It's kind of a pay to play component within that grant application process. One specifically is the Department of Local Affairs grant, the EIAF, which is Energy Impact Assistance Fund grant. That's a mouthful. But they actually require their applicants to provide 50% of the cost as grant matching dollars. What's nice about the EPC program is that any of those identified cost savings, DOLA will recognize those as, money that goes towards that matching component of the grant. And so there's a similar process that works with the Department of Education's BEST program for K through 12 school districts. So yeah, we had language passed that allowed for us to use those identified savings as dollars towards that grant match.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Jim.
Yeah, on the middle one there, the high efficiency program for 11 million. Could you define neighborhood scale? So this is not somebody that just wants to put electric mini splits in their house. This is a whole neighborhood. And what's kind of the definition of neighborhood scale?
All right, so I would definitely take feedback from Michael or Keith on this, but I think your assumptions are correct. It's not, one-off projects. It's neighborhood. It's multiple beneficiaries to some sort of energy improvement system.
Christine.
One other to mention is another bill that gives a 10% tax credit for heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and electric panel upgrades. So maybe that's one that would apply for individual households or buildings.
Yep, Christine, that's a good one to mention. Should have put it on the slide.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the questions. And Dylan, thanks again for being here and for sharing that overview. If anyone has any other questions that come up for Dylan, feel free to drop those in the chat. Otherwise, I think we can go ahead and move on. So we just went through, how our Colorado buildings, the private sector ones, some financing options for them, as well as financing options for our public buildings. And so now let's dive into, and I'm going to pass it off to Julia, additional programs to support compliance.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. And thanks again to Dylan and Tracy. That was great information. And really, I think it does help to inform kind of some of the conversation that we'll have around our programs to support compliance recommendations. So we have had a couple of conversations about this to date. We met during our optional meeting a couple of weeks ago and really dug into programs to support compliance. But for those of you who weren't in the optional meeting, you may remember that we also did wrap up the end of our last conversation in the full task force meeting to discuss these various options that we have in terms of programs to support compliance and then equity in workforce. So as a reminder, we are looking at these three aspects separately. So we'll first discuss programs to support compliance, and then we'll take a vote on the recommendation there, and then we'll dive into programs to support equity, and then we'll have a vote on that one. And then we'll dive into the programs to support workforce. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about the questions that you have or comments or any additional language that you might want to see, which of those kind of categories that would best fit into so that we can make sure that we're just organizing our conversation appropriately. So as a little background, our programs to support compliance, the conversations that we've had over the last few meetings to discuss this, really in terms of ensuring that we are providing building owners and building operators across the state with the information and the tools and resources that they need in order to comply with the BPS. There were three main areas, buckets, so to speak, that these programs kind of fell into. And those were education, financing, and partnerships. So under education, we talk about things like building tours, case studies, webinars, trainings for building owners and managers, and obviously direct community outreach. A lot of talk about conversations about making sure that that outreach also is in language that is appropriate to the audience. So in multiple languages as needed. We just heard about some of the financing programs that are currently available. We talked a lot about tax credits and some other financing options. So we can talk about that a little bit more. And then partnerships is the other broad bucket. So that would be just broadly engaging with organizations or folks who have existing relationships with building owners to get the word out, to make sure that they have access to the resources, tools, and support that they need to comply with the BPS. So building off of all of those conversations, we have put together a proposal on programs to support compliance. If you want to advance the slide, Kim, thank you. So I will give you just a moment to read through this.
Julia, I think we can, because there's a lot of text on the slide, the task force can read this, but maybe we go through it line by line and discuss some of these points and then have a vote at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So our general language at the beginning is, just stating that the task force does recommend that the state of Colorado work with organizations across the state to develop some programs. And the examples of the programs that should be considered include, the first one we have is one of those education programs, so provide trainings and webinars on the BPS to building owners and managers, industry groups, utilities, and any other entities that have strong connections with building owners. Any thoughts or comments or suggestions for changes on that point? The next one we have is regarding facilitating tours of highly energy efficient building, providing case studies and hosting seminars with webinars on retrofit options for buildings. And sort of related to that is the third one of conducting direct outreach in rural areas to covered buildings that are locally owned and operated. Any thoughts or comments, suggestions for changes on any of those first 3 bullet points there? Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
That third bullet is a little hard to understand what is meant by covered buildings. Maybe that could be clearer.
I can clear that up. Covered
Okay.
buildings, all the buildings covered under the benchmarking and BPS statute. So covered buildings just mean all the buildings that have to comply with the BPS.
And that, Jim, that is language that we've used in other proposals, I think, and throughout kind of our conversations here. But if we want to change that, then we always can. And I apologize, I am getting a message that I might have a small delay, so I'm sorry if I talk over anyone.
Okay, thanks.
But does that third bullet point imply that you would reach out to every individual covered building in a rural area? I'm still confused by how that's written. To me, it's a little hard to understand exactly what is intended there.
I can actually add a little or try to explain this. Sorry, Julia. So with our benchmarking program, we have a list of around 8,700 buildings right now. So once our benchmarking data comes in, we will be able to know what buildings are in Denver or what buildings are in the Western Slope. And so the state or other entities that we can work with, we can identify certain areas of rural areas and the buildings that are over 50,000 square feet, commercial, multifamily, or public, and conduct outreach, call them, send mailers, send emails, and provide them this information of there are these tours in your area, there are these programs and webinars that you can learn from. So that's what that bullet meant, but we're open to some wording changes there if that's not very clear.
Yeah, from what I read,
Christine, did you want to stress?
I wouldn't have assumed what you just said. To me, those are different.
Maybe you have a different way to phrase it, Paul, but I think that's the intent. And when I'd looked at the list of covered buildings a while ago and where they're located, almost all buildings are located in populated areas. And a lot of the big buildings in rural areas are ones that don't qualify, like agriculture or public buildings. And then there's just a few, relatively speaking, that would be covered that are over 50,000 square feet and are in one of these far-flung areas and are not part of a national chain that would already be keyed into making sure they're in compliance with state law. So for those ones in that unique situation, I think if there's budget, reaching out to them directly would be warranted to make sure A, that they know about it, and B, that they know where to start for some assistance.
Karen, go ahead.
I agree that we should have it in here, but it's just, it's an awkward sentence. If we could just talk about targeted outreach to buildings that are building owners, just it's really, I think it's causing some of the confusion. It's a great point, but it's needs some work.
Yeah, so perhaps conduct direct outreach or targeted outreach to building owners of covered buildings in rural areas. Would that be more clear?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm thinking you're You mean direct as in you're going to contact them individually, correct? I mean, you're going to make that phone call or whatever. I guess the whole direct thing is bothering me. I don't know what direct, we have direct mailing, we have, if you could just be a little more specific that you're going to contact building owners and conduct targeted outreach or something along those lines. It seems like we were just using the wrong words.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. And we did have that text of locally owned and operated in there because there were some comments in the optional meeting regarding focusing on building owners of buildings that are not, I think the words that were used were like big box retail or something like that. So, so that's why we included locally owned and operated. Although I think it is worth noting that, perhaps all building owners could use that support in rural areas. Okay, so we have updated this to contact and conduct a targeted outreach to building owners in rural areas. Does that sit well with folks now, or do we still need to make some changes to it?
I would ask that you put back in covered buildings. I think that's an important term for this group.
Okay, great. Perfect. And I apologize. I have turned off my camera just to save a little bandwidth. Hopefully that avoids the delay issues that I'm having. If that sounds good, then we'll move on to the next few bullet points. So the fourth one is ensure that all outreach and educational materials are available in multiple languages and are relevant to a broad set of audiences. Any concerns or comments regarding that one? Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I know it wasn't me who brought this up in an earlier meeting, but how important it is to have someone who understands the technical terms in a language. You don't get somebody who doesn't understand the business. So if there's a way to capture that instead of just calling up for an interpreter or whatever, if there's anything like that, is maybe make sure that they have access to a professional in the field in their language. I don't know if that's possible, but I sure would like it to be possible.
Okay, great.
Karen, do you have any recommended wording on that? We do have some wording on that captured in the workforce proposal of a little bit of that captured. So if you have any recommended wording options, we can try to include it at the end here.
Yeah, and if you could just maybe you have to hedge a little bit and say, when possible, provide professionals. I don't know, maybe our engineers can help me with this, but industry professionals who can speak the language is not the right term there, but you're getting where I'm going. Maybe you guys could think about that.
How does that
Great.
sound to some of you? We can also flesh this out in the recommendations as well, of like what this actually means too.
And if you do have language in the workforce, this gets to workforce too. I'm sorry, they are related. I know they're in two, but if we can carry over the language you used for that one, that'd be great.
Great. Okay, so we have now ensure that all outreach and educational materials are available in multiple languages and are relevant to a broad set of audiences and, if possible, provided by industry professionals. The fifth bullet we have bolded because you did just hear a little bit more about CPACE and then obviously the EPC program as well. But this bullet references CPACE directly. So curious if there is anything that we feel like should be edited in this bullet now that we have learned a little bit more about the program. Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
Sorry. It's just in the chat, I was reading, somebody talked about the potential of utility rebates, and I don't know if we have a utility person on. I don't see one on my screen, but I think we should just talk about, make sure that there's that catch-all, that says you can name the ones, and then, and who knows, this program may beget some great opportunities that we don't have in yet. So just a catch-all.
Okay, great, good point.
Are we thinking those incentives would include incentives at the federal level? And would we want to provide a more specific explanation of any of those?
That is a good question. I would think we could certainly include federal incentives. I'm not sure that needs to be detailed directly, but if the task force feels passionately about that, we certainly can.
Maybe just encourage people to look into it because they can be helpful.
All right, great. Stacy, and then Tracy, I saw your hand go up and then down, but.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think of a way to make the bullet more general. Maybe partly to Karen's point, right? We can start listing programs, but as soon as we start to list them, we will miss some. And so on that theme, or in that way, I really appreciate the bullet you've tried to add, including utility rebates, but I would encourage you to not create a list of those specific rebates because they change all the time. So you might just say, hey, building owners, check with your local utility because there may be a rebate, and that's it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Karen, I'll let you have the last comment, and then I want to move us to lobby and vote so we can move on to the next section of proposals.
Okay, to Stacy's point, it'd be great if we could flip this around and say, assure access to technical and financial assistance available, such as, but it just flip it around. That works for me. I don't know about others.
Okay, great. So we've got Crystal and Kim are madly typing there to update the language on this one. As they do, we can come back to it, but I want to touch on this last bullet really quickly, which is develop a technical assistance hub to provide coordinated technical assistance, guidance, and education to building owners. Any need for changes regarding that bullet point? All right, hearing none. Should this bullet point in the red here at the bottom replace the bolded one that's the fifth bullet point, or
I can.
Do you also
Julia, this is Keith. If I can step in for a minute, from Keith from the Energy Office. If I hear, I think Karen and Stacy correctly, what is now bolded in the fifth bullet point, the language there might better be reflected in some ways in what's in the bullet point below that with respect to developing a hub or a resource for financing that would include CPACE, other programs, probably links to utility incentive programs, because I agree with Stacy, having spent almost 20 years in utility DSM programs, I don't want to have to track down the changes in those things on any sort of regular basis. But really trying to maximize the access, including potentially to federal funds, or at least make it easier for building owners to understand what options are out there and to help them get to those resources. And so I think that hub concept is probably what I heard Karen and Stacy speaking to with respect to the financing component. And I apologize if I've gotten wrong what either of you were saying, but that's what I think I had heard.
Great.
We can work on that
Great.
language.
So we have moved that around. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this language doesn't have to be finalized. We can certainly massage it as we're working on those final recommendations. Karen, last comment, and then we'll move to a vote.
Okay, I have to say now that we have the bullet 4 or the number 4, I just think that should say, you know, it says something about outreach and educational, but it doesn't say the resources for financing, and you can't implement them if you can't read about them. So if we could just, and if people agree, that's fine. We don't have to wordsmith it right now, but they need to be connected. They need to have people in their industry be able to explain the incentives to them or whatever, financial options. Thank you.
Great. Great, okay. So here's the language as it stands now. Crystal, are you launching the poll? Great.
And we have 12 task force members voting. The poll is now launched. Okay, it says I think, never mind. Missing one vote, but again, if someone is calling in, okay, that has now come through.
There we go. All right. Looks like we have full support for this proposal, which is fantastic. All right. We'll move on to discuss our equity proposals. Great. And as with the other ones, we have discussed these at a couple of the past meetings. Some of the key components that have come out of our discussions of equity considerations are considerations for Section 3 businesses. So ensuring that businesses, that business and contracting is given to Colorado businesses. Again, that point on bilingual or multilingual outreach is well stated. And an emphasis on indoor air quality is something that has come out of our conversations around equity. So looking into green leasing programs and educating on disproportionate impacts of climate change and its impacts on air quality. Moving forward from these conversations, we've developed a few draft proposals for your consideration. And looking at there we go. Looking at these programs to support equity. So again, these are recommendations to the state of Colorado to work with various organizations in the state to develop programs to advance equitable outcomes through the implementation of the BPS. So we've grouped these programs for equity into kind of 3 main buckets. The first being provide training focused on building, commissioning, and engineering for affordable housing. The second is related to leveraging existing programs. So we had a specific discussion in the optional meeting about the Enterprise Green Community Program. So that is noted here specifically as one of the programs that can be leveraged to develop standards and connect building owners to resources such as tax credits. Also, leveraging existing green leasing programs to encourage gross lease structures is something that was discussed. And then thirdly, providing support and resources specifically directed to under-resourced building owners. We had a lot of ideas from the group regarding what that could look like. And some examples are developing a process for identifying under-resourced building owners and targeting them for outreach and engagement, providing technical assistance to under-resourced building owners that may include energy assessments and advanced technical support, and seeking funding to provide grants and incentives to under-resourced building owners that help them comply with the BPS while requiring prevailing wage, best value contracting, and that a certain percentage of underrepresented business owners be involved. So getting at that Section 3 component again. Any comments, thoughts, changes? John, please go ahead.
Just a question on number 1 there. Is it providing training or actually providing the actual commissioning or engineering for affordable housing?
That is a good question. I believe our discussion focused on training. I would look to the CO staff to see if the other aspect of that John mentioned is something that is that CEO would be available to do.
Michael, are you still on? This is Keith Hay, sorry. So I'm not sure Michael is still with us or not, but you know, we've talked a bit about what, from a resource perspective, financially, the Energy Office can help with in terms of the different types of programs in the prior section. I think here we're really focusing on a workforce issue and being able to provide some workforce training related to, you know, commissioning and engineering around affordable housing. And so not necessarily providing that work directly. But certainly we'll take that thought back and you know, think about what else we might be able to do going forward.
I guess my question is just, what is training on building commissioning or training on engineering? Sorry, I just don't understand that.
I think the purpose of this was kind of like the similar number one on the previous proposal of providing training and resources of the options available to affordable housing.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Now I get it.
So, okay,
Thank
we
you.
need to put those words in.
No, I don't mean to make you change everything, but now I get it. Thank you.
Great. Kara.
Thanks. I had two thoughts on this proposal. The first is maybe like the discussion on the prior one, on point two, the first bullet point, such as the enterprise green communities. I think another really powerful equity effort is emerging at the federal scale, the Justice 40. And I think there's also going to be some funding attached to that. And there's also a really potentially useful tool called the Climate and Equity Justice Screening Tool that actually maps out disadvantaged communities across the country and specifically within our state, so that you can identify if your area could potentially benefit from some of these other federal programs. So I think maybe expanding, you know, maybe we can suggest that they build out more of these resources similar to the funding conversation on the prior slide. My second comment was on the gross lease structures. I think we should just say green lease structures, because you can have net leases that are also, you know, with incentives that are aligned. But having specified gross, it just feels like a little too prescriptive.
Great.
And maybe we want to provide programs on that as well, like IMT's Green Lease Leaders Program, something like that, to provide additional resources on what that could look like in application. Thanks.
Great. Karen, please go ahead.
I don't know what a green lease is, and it's not capitalized. So I just wanted to make sure we had a definition for it. That's all.
That's something that I think we could add into the recommendations document. Unless folks feel like it should be here within the recommendations themselves. Paul?
Yeah, thanks. I'm still wrestling with the real meaning of the first statement, the bullet point number one. We do a lot of affordable housing as well as market rate housing and condominiums across Colorado. The affordable housing we design is uniformly the highest performing. It's always the market rate that's the crap. So I understand the desire to support the affordable housing sector, but generally those are clients who have pretty good base level of knowledge, often higher than our market rate clients. So I don't know that providing training is really impactful in that sector. That the struggle in that sector is the actual funding for the improvements. So I just don't see one as really doing anything positive for the client that I work with. And it's a nice idea. I just don't see it making a difference.
Does taking out that training and just focusing on the educational resources and perhaps adding educational and
financial resources expanded to multifamily housing generally. The problems aren't just with the affordable sector. It's all multifamily housing is some of the lowest quality construction we have out there. And the market rate is the worst.
Thank you for that.
All of our housing clients and multifamily housing clients, I think, need help. If we want to add affordable, great, but I don't think that's the limit of the issue we need to solve.
Thank you, Paul. Are there any other recommendations from the task force around this line? When we were discussing equity, affordable housing came up. I will say our benchmarking program is addressing affordable housing issues as well right now. So would the task force like to make this more general towards residential multifamily or specifically call out affordable housing?
Well, I'll just jump in. I think there's two issues here though of importance. I agree with Paul that we just need to figure out a way to get it to happen better, especially to the clients that don't know about the benefits of commissioning. So I'm a real fan of the educational component of this comment. But the second issue is commissioning is expensive and affordable housing projects often are just scraping by. So maybe there can be some subsidy available to affordable housing commissioning efforts.
Great. Christine, did you have a comment on this one as well?
It does seem like we have a lot of financial incentives and programs available, especially through the infrastructure bill and so forth. So part of it seems to be connecting affordable housing to the money that's coming available, and probably not just making them aware of it, but helping with applying for it. Because if they're barely scratching by, no one has time for a multi-month proposal to put together for funding that's uncertain. So that was a general comment. And more specifically, Kara, when you were mentioning enterprise green communities, I think of that as being specific to affordable multifamily. So I was wondering if you wanted that under number 1 rather than number 2.
I'll defer to you on where that best fits. I'm less familiar of the ins and outs of the enterprise green communities program.
Okay, then I think I would put it under number 1.
Okay.
Great. And I'm not sure about Justice 40 either, but I would think that those two would go under number 1.
Great. Jim, did you still have a comment to share? No, okay, great. All right. Crystal and Kim are furiously typing away to make these changes. As they are doing that, any comments or thoughts on the third bullet point, the provide support and resources directly, they're directed at under resource building owners? Any updates that need to be made to that one? All right, hearing none. Kim and Chris, oh yeah, go ahead, Stacey.
On the last bullet, seek funding to provide grants and incentives. I wonder if that's where we could say something about also connecting to existing funding that's out there, making those connections.
Great.
Seek new funding or provide connections to existing grants and incentives.
Perfect. Stacey, go ahead.
Yeah, well, we got a lot of good stuff on the equity slide here, and but I guess I was noticing on the previous slide when we talked about the considerations overview, we talked about kind of a preference for local contractors and local workers, but then there's nothing in this list that kind of references some of the things that were on the previous slide. So maybe that comes later, or
Yeah,
did we just miss it?
I think those are addressed more in the workforce section, which will be our next section, Stacy. All right. Perfect. Looks like Kim and Crystal have made the edits here. So now we have the first bullet point stating provide educational resources on programs and financing options and provide funding application support to multifamily and affordable housing. And underneath that, leverage programs such as the Enterprise Green Communities Program, Justice 40 Program, and others to connect multifamily building owners to resources such as tax credits. Our second point now says leverage existing programs to support building owners in complying with the BPS, and note specifically leverage existing green lease programs such as IMT's Green Lease Leaders Program to encourage green lease structures. And then our third point now says provide support and resources specifically directed at under-resourced building owners, develop a process for identifying under-resourced building owners and targeting them for outreach and engagement, provide technical assistance to support under-resourced building owners that may include energy assessments and advanced technical support, and provide connections to existing grants and incentives to under-resourced building owners that help them comply with the BPS while requiring prevailing wage best value contracting, and that a certain percentage of underrepresented business owners will be involved. Any final thoughts or comments on any of these before we move to a vote?
I have one very quick comment for the task force. We don't need to wordsmith this right now, but for number 2, we can combine that into one because we've done some wordsmithing. So we can change that to leverage existing programs to, as well as existing green leasing programs to support building owners. We can change that after though.
Great point, Crystal. In that case, Crystal, could you go ahead and launch the vote for this one? All right.
It doesn't change the substance, but I thought the last bullet is maybe 2 different big issues, so maybe that's 2 bullets.
Okay, great. We'll note that and can look at addressing that as we finalize the recommendations. Thanks, Christine. All right. So finally, we have our programs to support workforce. And within those, then there are a couple of key components that come up, and we've already touched on these already, so I won't belabor it. But one major comment that we heard in the optional meeting was the difference between trainings and career pathways. So a focus on emphasizing and providing pathways that help folks become accredited and licensed professionals was definitely desired. Hire local is something that came up again and again, enhancing process of periodic commissioning and providing incentives through recognition of exceptional building operations and maintenance. So from those, we developed a number of proposals here for your consideration. Kim, could you advance us to the next slide? Thank you. So along the lines of those 4 pieces that came up, the examples of programs to support workforce that should be considered are firstly connecting affordable housing residents covered by the BPS to trainings and jobs related to the building sector, especially those related to building upgrades relevant for their own building. Secondly, encouraging, and if public funds are invested, consider requirements regarding hiring local workforce firms and apprenticeship programs. I'll note that this one is in red because it does include some edits from the CEO team regarding what is legally possible within the framework of what the state agency can do. The third bullet is collaborating with and promoting accredited training programs to help participants finish with a state license in a building related field. Next is partnering with universities, community colleges, trade schools, and high schools to promote trade-based career pathways and connect students to licensure programs in order to train students on commercial building efficiency. Fifth is collaborating to offer trainings for building operators and offer reduced cost trainings for under-resourced building operators and managers. Next is developing a list of preferred contractors that have the qualifications to meet BPS requirements and support workforce development. And finally, developing a recognition program that rewards excellence in building operations and maintenance. Any comments, thoughts, suggestions on these 7 bullet points here? Karen, please.
I had a question on number 2, the red one. Just that, and I know that our other state agencies do some of this. Is there any way that we could, because especially in light of number 7, if there was something we could do to show recognition for those, you know, for folks who do hire locally? I don't know. It just seems like that there's an incentive recognition program for building operations and maintenance. There should be one for number 2. That's it.
Great. So getting that added there. Cecil, please go ahead.
I'm also under number 2 there, kind of the second half of that where it says, consider requirements regarding hiring local workforce and apprenticeship programs. That's kind of partially best value contracting. Is it possible to put, registered apprenticeship programs in there?
Absolutely.
The other part of best value contracting is prevailing wage. Is that something to add in this section, or because it's in a different section, is that going to cover it?
I would think that that fits in here. Do you think it's this bullet specifically, or is there another one on this list that
that list of, the local workforce, the registered apprenticeship programs, and prevailing wage are kind of the main points of best value contracting.
Okay, perfect.
And Cecil, just to clarify, so this would read then regarding hiring local workforce firms, registered apprenticeship programs, and then can you repeat that last piece?
Prevailing, paying prevailing wage.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Just want to make sure I captured that correctly.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Cecil. Christine.
To me, the very first sentence of the slide doesn't seem to capture the opportunity for getting a well-trained and prepared workforce. I think it's more than just making sure people aren't unduly impacted, but actually building a green workforce. And so maybe that could be revised. I think the second sentence is more what we really want to say. So even perhaps just deleting the rest of that first sentence and recommend that we, there we go. Thanks.
All right. Great. Karen.
I just want to do a shout out for, there's also local workforce needed when those heat pumps are manufactured here. So I'll just say, if it goes beyond just the building sector. The manufacturing sector creates workforce too.
Great. Jim?
Yeah, back to the prevailing wage issue. That one maybe requires a little clarity, because if prevailing wages are encouraged, but it's optional, that's one thing. I would agree with that. But if it's a requirement that kicks in Davis-Bacon wages for an entire project, that could be a huge issue for a project happening versus not, because there's a different cost structure throughout all the trades for prevailing wage on a Davis-Bacon job.
So are you suggesting that we take out or modify the word requirement here?
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll go back to Cecil, because he suggested this. If there's a way of wording this, Cecil, where we're encouraging it but not requiring it, what do you think about that?
Yes, he's.
I mean, it's always our, you know, the better you pay your workforce, usually the better they perform, the more they're typically going to know. I prefer paying prevailing wage in there. You know, every sector has a prevailing wage. So it's not one standard wage for the whole project. It's each individual trade has their own prevailing wage. I think it's, you know, like that states, if it's, you know, someone privately funding the project, that's their project. They can, you know, pay their people whatever they want. But if it's public funds, I think we should do our best to make sure that the workers on those projects are appropriately compensated for the work they're doing.
I agree with that. And it's really an economic cycle issue too. I mean, right now, a lot of people are getting paid more than prevailing wage just because the demand is so high. I don't know. I think this could still be tempered because in this number 2, we have both the word encourage and require, and it could be a little confusing. I would still make a vote for leaving the prevailing wage as the encouraged as opposed to the require.
I don't think that AQCC has the authority to require prevailing wage, do they? Seems like that would be a legislature thing.
Keith, I'm going to pass this over to you.
That's a great question, but I think that that's probably right.
And perhaps it should say encourage prevailing wage, and if public funds are invested,
additional encouragements or something like that.
Consider requirements regarding hiring local, or
I would say consider additional encouragements or something like that. Just the word requirements is the tough one here.
Great.
You know, and yeah.
That sounds good.
Let us think about, since that's an example, let us think about that, because we may need to think about language around public or partially publicly funded projects versus fully private projects. And this seems to blend the two, which may be leading to some of the confusion here in the conversation.
Well, and there are already requirements on certain kinds of public funding.
I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it may need just some further clarification post this conversation.
Great. Cecil, did you have another comment?
I was just going to say, you know, we can put in here encourage and do whatever, but it comes down to business owner is not going to pay more than what they have to. So unless you put something in there that's got a little something behind it, they're just going to blow past it and pay as little as they can. Just my opinion.
Great. So we do want to move on. We have a lot of other items to discuss today, so I want to make sure that we reserve time for that. Paul, I'll give you the last comment and then we'll move on to a vote. And before you do, I'll just note that Katrina had suggested in the chat that we update the reference to license to be license, credential, or certification. So we have made that change. Thank you, Katrina.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So I just want to comment that we've got just about every entity that would be involved in this enterprise except the design community. So I'd like to add something about coordinating with professional design organizations in one of the bullet points, or else add a bullet about that.
Perfect.
Remember, you don't build it before you design it. So you got to start.
Absolutely. Is there a bullet you would see that added to, Paul? Or
either way, it could be popped in somewhere else. And we talked about building operators. It could be building operators and designers, or if you think it's separate enough, then we could craft a bullet that would be separate.
Perfect. Got it there, added to bullet 5.
Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Great. I think we are ready to move to a vote.
I'll just address John's comment in the chat that number 7, the bullet number 7, is talking about LEED certification unless there's another recognition or monetary recognition. This bullet was written as that the state or another entity would help develop this to recognize the buildings that apply to our BPS, not referring to LEED.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. All right, with that, I think we're ready to launch the poll. Thank you.
We're just waiting on one vote. There we go.
All right, we have unanimous consent again. Thank you all so much. This is very exciting. Again, we will continue to work on some of the language and some of the questions regarding prevailing wage and requirements, etc. We do want to give you all a couple of minutes to stretch your legs, go get a drink of water or a bio break, whatever you might need. If you could come back in 3 minutes at 2:35, that'll put us right back on track to wrap up our conversation today. Hey, Kim, you want to update that slide? I think we can still have people come back by like 2:40 or 2:35.
Okay, everyone. It is 2:40, so if you guys hear my voice, please start making your way back to your computers. We'll go ahead and get started. If you guys can turn your camera on when you arrive back at your computer, that would be helpful so that I know you guys are there. And when I see the majority of faces, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, thanks for those who came back. For those who are not back yet, if you can hear me, please make your way back to your desks. And we're going to dive into the second half of our meeting today. All right, and I see Crystal there, so I think we're good to go. So, all right, hopefully everyone enjoyed a brief moment to stretch and get some water, or use the restroom, or whatever you needed to do. So let's dive in. So the second half of our meeting today is going to be discussing some proposals for topics. Well, the first topic that we're going to cover, demand flexibility, is one that we've covered a couple times in various meetings, whether they be full task force meetings or optional meetings. And so we'd like to come to some sort of consensus decision today on how we're going to move forward demand flexibility as far as our recommendations go. And then we have two new proposals that we'll cover in the second half of today's meeting, related to pieces of statute that the CEO recognized between our last meeting and this meeting that we needed to discuss, or that we had the flexibility to discuss with the task force. So let's first go ahead and dive into the demand flexibility overview. So first, I want to say a big thank you to Kara for your help in crafting this and helping us with the language so that this is something that our team has a much greater understanding of. And so basically what we wanted to do is sort of share an overview of what the demand flexibility really would mean for the BPS, and then share a couple of the concerns from the state about including it. And then we'll pause and see if there's any questions or discussion from the group. And then we'll kind of vote if we want, basically we'll have a vote if we want to include this or not include this in our recommendations. If we do want to include it in the recommendations, we'll move to a proposal on the next slide. So to quickly run through this overview, I'm sure you guys are reading this already, but demand flexibility is key to creating a low cost, low carbon grid and reducing operating costs. Demand flexibility is the ability to shift building energy use patterns on a seasonal, hourly, or minute-based timescale to co-optimize for energy costs, emissions, grid services, occupant needs, and preferences in a continuous and integrated way. It's supported by smart technologies like advanced sensors and controls, data analytics, and can help manage and adjust a building's load profile. So some concerns that the state has related to incorporating demand flexibility are, even though demand flexibility can help lower a building's cost, it does not necessarily decrease a building's site EUI or emissions. Any savings from participation in demand flexibility program may be hard for the state to verify, and not all owners across the state, depending on the utility, will have access to this option. So first I'll pause, and Keith or Crystal, do you guys want to add any color or context to some of those concerns?
Thank you. This is Keith. I'm not sure I need to add a lot of either of those. I mean, we are very much open to the inclusion of demand flexibility. I think what we're really trying to understand right now is that if site EUI is the primary metric, how demand flexibility should be accounted for under a framework that really is focused on energy use intensity, where it's not really potentially changing overall load, it's just shifting timing of load. And so that was the one issue that I at least felt like hadn't really focused on and needed to think more carefully about it. In some ways, perhaps it's more of an accounting question than a substantive concern over the value of demand flexibility. And so that was the primary genesis of my concerns.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. So would love to hear from the rest of the task force if there are any thoughts that you guys want to share ahead of a vote on whether or not we include this as a compliance option? Jim.
Well, we're a big fan of this. We've been installing it in every building that we've been doing for the last few years, and it's paid some good benefits. I completely agree with the state's concerns, though. So maybe we don't make this a compliance option, but it's strongly encouraged.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jim. Stacy.
Yeah, I'm not sure the right word for it, whether it becomes a compliance pathway or just something to consider. I think in my mind, I'm always thinking about the intent, whether we get the language right in all of this work that we've been doing is to be seen yet. But I think about the intent, and I'm thinking of two things that maybe it's not clear on this slide, but I think it was in some other documentation where we did talk about either today or in the future, there could be different emissions factors relative to different hours of the day. And therefore, the demand flexibility, while it might not change the site EUI, the thing by which we're benchmarking buildings, it may in fact have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and therefore it has a benefit. So potentially, right? So I think that's one complicated consideration. And then the other thing that I think about with the intent, which maybe this demand flexibility was getting to, but just that idea that we did not want to penalize people who made preliminary changes that were leaning into the direction of the future that we want them to lean into, that will ultimately both reduce their EUI and reduce their emissions. If they make a change that's a phase or a step in their process today that puts them on the path, ultimately reaching the targets and the goals. So anyway, those are the two intents that I'm thinking about and trying to keep in mind in this context.
Thank you, Stacey. Bill, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I see demand flexibility as almost a requirement with the push towards electrification. I think as we get more electrified, this is almost going to be necessary just so that the grid doesn't become unstable. So, I would be in great support of including it because I think we're going to have it.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Joel, I'll pass it to you.
So I agree with what both Stacy and Bill just said. I think those are excellent points. My thinking is that this demand flexibility purpose here is really to orient the BPS standard and program towards the future. I'm about to speak a blasphemy in public here, but when in a 100% renewable future, maybe energy efficiency becomes a little less important. And in that future, demand flexibility becomes that much more important. And I do see that this particular clause provides a pathway under the state law for those that are doing things to benefit the grid and to benefit that 100% renewable future we're looking towards, and to capture credit for that under this new standard. So I do support keeping it in, I think personally, but I certainly acknowledge that there's issues that we'll have to reconcile.
I'm going to chime in really quickly too. Thank you for everyone's feedback so far too. Not saying that we can't still vote and include this as a core compliance pathway, but as you saw with the other proposals we'll be discussing in a bit, there is a 2030 proposal too. And so if we do vote this in, we can always add some wording for the BPS past 2030 of exploring demand flexibility if those programs are more available and the state will know more then too. So just an option to keep in your heads.
And if I may, this is Keith, just sort of one final point on this. Well, I expressed some of the concern on this. I fully expect that Friday when we see Xcel Energy drop its latest DSM plan, we are likely to see demand flexibility be part of that plan. And I would anticipate that other utilities will be bringing demand flexibility programs forward for building owners to participate in. And so, whatever the task force decides to do, I wouldn't want to see it create a barrier to building owners participating in those programs, because it will provide a lot of benefit to the grid and to the customers. So.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Paul, to you, and then Katrina, go to you next.
Yeah, thanks. All really good points in conversation. I think it's an interesting point. We probably should be completely supporting demand and flexibility here, but I think it's a separate issue from our core issue, which is building performance standards. In my view, this does very little to address individual building performance. It's about time of use, and it's about limiting peak demand both at the building level and at the utility scale. Critical issues, but I don't think I would view this as a compliance pathway.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, Katrina.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think I agree with the direction that Paul is going. This is incredibly important for the future of our grid and the future of climate solutions, but it's not a part of the building's own performance. Like Paul was saying, I also struggle with how the accounting on this works, because the utility, I assume, would be claiming the greenhouse gas emission reductions from these demand flexibility programs that they run and that they pay customers to participate in. And so I think there's already pretty strong incentives to participate in, again, these are to be determined future programs, but hopefully they're paying customers for this service that helps them reduce grid emissions. And so wouldn't it be sort of double counting, and we then also count those emission reductions in some way here? I would encourage us to stay focused on building performance, but I also see all the value in this.
Bill, did you want to respond to Katrina quick on that point?
Yeah, I really just wanted to chime in that I think I agree with both Paul and Katrina on this. I think that there would be significant difficulties with being able to quantify any emissions reductions. And as Katrina said, I think it will raise significant double counting issues with emissions reductions in the utility sector. So I'm having a very hard time understanding how we could have it be a compliance option as opposed to something that we're simply encouraging buildings to do.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Kara, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, thanks for the thoughtful consideration and points on this so far. I think there's no doubt it's challenging from an accounting perspective, but I see this really as critical in driving the change that we want to see in buildings today. If it's not done at the building scale, and potentially using the BPS as like an intervention point to drive those improvements, there's no way the grid is going to be able to achieve the grid side goals. So I would encourage us to kind of lift up from kind of our sector biases and really think about the ultimate goal that we want to achieve here, which is emissions reductions. I think that this, we know that demand flexibility does reduce emissions. And so I think it's really leveraging the BPS as an opportunity to get these technologies into buildings for the critical future that we see and we need to drive towards.
Yeah, thanks, Kara, for that. Bill, I'll pass it back to you.
I totally agree with Kara in her points in that, we are pushing people towards electrification. And if we're peaking the grid at certain points, the way they meet that is, peaking turbines burning natural gas. And so we need the ability, and we should encourage the ability as a compliance option for a building to reduce demand so the grid demand also goes down. I think it's critical. So enough.
Sorry, finding my unmute button. Kara, back to you, and then, I'm sorry. Okay, I see you took your hand down. Karen, over to you.
I would just say it's not, I just want to go back, if we could, CEO staff, and just tell us if this matches what our task is with the Building Performance Task Force. Not saying it's not important, it is important. And there is equipment that will help buildings do this, and they should be installing it as part of that process. But has anybody looked back at the statute to see if this fits, especially in light of the fact that we have site EIU? All points are great. I just want to make sure that we're on task.
I'll let Will and Keith chime in, but this is still under the task force's recommendations. It does pertain to buildings, but it's up to the task force if you want to include this as a compliance option. There's nothing specifically in the statute that talks about the site EUI or anything like that. It just tells the task force to come up with these recommendations. But Keith and Will, let me know if I'm glossing over anything.
I mean, I think that's accurate. What we do need to be able to show, or at least ultimately what will need to be shown in the rulemaking process, is that the rules as a whole will achieve at least a 20% sector-wide reduction in GHG emissions. To the extent that, you know, we add in demand flexibility and are unable to quantify emissions reductions associated with it, it would just mean that we would have to have stronger requirements in other areas. Like we might have to have lower site EUI numbers, you know, in order to assure that sector-wide we would achieve those emissions reductions.
Thanks, Will. All right, we'll do Joel, Jim, and then over to Christine. Thank you all for your thoughtful comments on this.
One quick clarification. Demand flexibility in terms of demand response and so forth, as it's operated today, typically does not have an emission credit associated with it. It is done purely based on economics, supply and demand, as we talked about before. There may be programs out there, utility programs, that do take credit for emissions reductions, but I'm not aware of any. I think that's part of our dilemma is, if we do allow this, how do we take credit for the emission reductions that we know economy-wide will result from a cleaner grid and enabling that cleaner grid?
Thank you, Joel. Jim, over to you.
Yeah, after hearing all this commentary, I think we should keep it in as a compliance option, even though it causes accounting headaches. We've got personal experience with this. We know it works. We got approached on one of our buildings recently by the demand management system installer, and he said, look, I'll front the cost for you and I'll share in the savings. So it won't cost you a dime to put this into your building. So this is a triple win. It helps the grid. It helps us get ready for the future. And it does reduce emissions, and it doesn't cost building owners anything if it's done that way. Or even if you upfront cost pay for it, then you're getting a payback in 4 to 5 years. So I'm a real fan.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. We'll go Karen, and then I think Karen will let you wrap up our comments, and then we'll move to a vote.
I just wanted to make sure, in light of the comments that were just made, when I hear complicated and complex and difficult accounting, does that match some of our strategy or goals in other goals? This is not supposed to be rocket science. So I just want to make sure that, you know, our building owners who may be less savvy will be able to figure this out. It's important, but I just want to make sure they can figure it out.
So
That's
Karen,
it.
this is Keith. I'm not sure that the challenge on accounting really falls to the building owners. I think that as we think about drafting, you know, rules, and the division is bringing rules before the Air Commission, working out how any emissions credits would be attributed, that's where it's going to get sticky and challenging. I mean, it's clear that if there's no utility money involved, there's one way to do it. But once you participate in utility programs, as Katrina was suggesting, it creates other challenges because the utilities are going to want to claim credit for that. And so I don't think that at least as I think about the challenge, it won't of accounting, it won't really be one that building owners would see. It really would be during the rulemaking process as we think about how to try and account for any credit that would be attributed. I think it would be manageable for a building owner on the back end. You know, they would just be doing the demand flexibility sort of calculus. And, you know, verifying that is going to be a different thing, and we'll have to figure out what that looks like. I don't mean to suggest that it's that simple, but I do think it would be workable if you wanted to bring it forward.
Thanks, Keith, and great question, Karen. Okay, I know I said last one, so Christine, I'll pass it to you because you had your hand up earlier and I didn't get to call on you. So,
but just because a building owner has smart technology installed and can do demand flexibility doesn't mean that it would match up with the emissions profile of the grid, right? I think Joel was saying we just don't have the technologies widespread out there that match the emissions from the grid to the demand flexibility at the building level. That seems like the missing piece.
thanks, Christine. So this is really great thoughts and comments from everyone. I'm going to share Paul's note in the chat as well. If demand management is so important, there should be a different program that promotes and supports it. If every building owner implemented DM, would that get us to the target? So in order to keep us moving along, we're going to pose a vote, and the vote will be whether or not we want to include demand flexibility as a compliance option for the BPS. And this doesn't give us any detail around what that looks like. This is just is it included as our recommendation or not for this core compliance piece? And we'll give everyone a moment to let the votes filter in. Oh man, I had a feeling that would happen. Crystal, if you want to share. Okay, so we are split right down the middle. And so I guess maybe perhaps some next steps, and Crystal, let me know your thoughts on this. When we get to the 2030 proposals, which we'll talk about in a minute, there could be an opportunity to include some language around demand flexibility there. So as Crystal mentioned, there is that opportunity. And I guess because we didn't get to consensus, well, Crystal, I don't know, do you have any, yeah, I was gonna say, thank you, Katrina, because it didn't reach the 2/3 majority, that means we would not be including it as a core compliance pathway per the task force rules that we've set for ourselves. So if you all have any additional thoughts or like, I think absolutely this needs to be included in some fashion, feel free to email us and we can continue to think about it. But as for now, we'll consider this out as far as a core compliance option as per our recommendations. Kara.
Just a question on that. If it doesn't become a core compliance option, what are the other options to get this intent included?
I would think that there's likely a chance we could include it as as a bullet under programs that support compliance or workforce programs, something to say we would encourage building owners to participate in demand flexibility. So it could be part of the educational resources that are provided. Or in the 2030 proposals that we'll talk about in a moment. And Crystal, are there any other opportunities, or Julia, that come to mind?
I was just going to say, agree with that point. And with the technical resource hub of providing resources and educational materials around this, building owners could certainly take advantage of it. It just wouldn't be like a compliance pathway. So we could still provide information around it and put it under the programs.
Awesome. Okay, well, I know that was well, I was expecting it to be a 50-50 through that conversation. So anyway, we will think about how we can include some of this intent in our programs for compliance proposals and include some bullets when we're drafting the final language to make sure that at least the intent around encouraging this technology is voiced somewhere. Okay, so with that, we will skip that proposal and we'll move on to the civil penalties piece. And Crystal, I'll pass it off to you to cover this one.
Thanks, Kim. So we've had some questions from the task force, and we've had some questions come through our public survey as well around the civil penalties for the BPS. We've heard some comments from the task force on this. And so when we were looking at statute, the statute lists the dollar amount for each violation. Apologies about that. But it does provide flexibility for the task force to make a recommendation around this. And so you'll see on this slide that the statute lists the violation of what it lists the dollar amount for violations. So a first violation cannot exceed $2,000 and a subsequent violation cannot exceed $5,000. That is listed in statute. That is not able to be changed by the task force. So, and I also want to provide some background around this as well. So, a building owner who is in repeated non-compliance. So whatever deadlines that we set, if they repeatedly do not comply, they would have multiple fines stacking on top of each other. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another very important consideration that again is listed in statute, public buildings, universities, state, federal buildings, it's listed in our statute. They do not have these civil penalties. So this is mostly for the commercial and multifamily buildings. Unless a building owner has been granted an adjusted compliance timeline or target, a waiver or a time extension, and they've gone through CEO and has applied, they have to abide by the BPS. So they haven't taken any action and the deadline passes, we would then assume that they have done nothing and they are not in compliance. And then just a little bit more background on the process. So, the Energy Office will be working with our implementer or our vendor, and we will, similar to our benchmarking program, we will do outreach. We will send mailers and phone calls leading up to that deadline, reminding them like, hey, you need to comply or submit this report. And once that deadline passes and we've done everything that we can to do this outreach and remind them of this, the Energy Office then works with CDPHE, and they are the ones who then talk to the building owner and set up meetings and start investigating what happened on the building owner side and how to implement those fines. So that comes under CDPHE's jurisdiction. So with that said, we did, Kim, you can go to the next slide. The Energy Office drafted a proposal around this. There you go. And so what we did was that we actually tried to add some definitions around what a first violation is, a second violation, and subsequent violations. The statute only lists what a first and subsequent violation is, so we wanted to try to spell that out a little bit more here. And so I'll walk the task force through the different bullets, but essentially the first violation would be a building owner does not submit their 2026 benchmarking report to the Energy Office by June 1st of 2027, or their 2030 benchmarking report by June 1st of 2031, and they have not met their site EUI target that was set for their property type. So that deadline, June 1st. So after that date, that would be the first penalty, and then that'd be the first violation, and that penalty, the max fine would be $2,000. Going into the second violation and not repeating all those details, again, if they do not submit their report within 30 days past that deadline, they would have another fine add on to that. And the max fine for that is $5,000. Again, CDPHE will be the one investigating, is it a $5,000 fine or is it a $2,000 fine? But these are just what the max fines can be. And so I listed some of the details here. If it's 30 days after the deadline and they haven't complied with either that first or second violation, they would have about a $7,000 max fine. And then we also wanted to think about going forward of, months go by, the building owner is not complying. So a subsequent violation that we defined here is that if a building owner is in violation with the BPS after 365 days, each additional week of non-compliance would then add up to another subsequent violation. And we didn't add a dollar sign or anything there. We just kind of defined what that subsequent violation would be after the second violation. Will, let me know if I glossed over any of the details here, if you want to add anything to this proposal.
No, I think that covers it very well. I think the concern was that, you know, if we were to consider violations only as taking place annually, the numbers would be so small that it would be possible for building owners to essentially ignore the BPS if they so wished. And having an escalating structure where the longer you are out of compliance, you know, essentially the shorter the periods would be that would be considered additional violations, would be a way of trying to be reasonable and not penalize folks who are just a little bit late, but create a strong incentive to comply over time.
Thanks, Will. I see a comment in the chat from Bill Green about benchmarking is done annually and it's based on annual energy use. You cannot determine after a week if a building is not in compliance. The Energy Office can, because the deadline is June 1st for the previous year's energy data. So they have 6 months from December 31st of 2026 until June 1st to submit their benchmarking report. And if there's any questions or comments on this proposal or discussion, we can take that now before we take on a vote of if the task force wants to include this in the recommendations.
Yeah, Jim, go for it.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is about the form of notice. Is it a certified mail and or electronic mail?
Are you talking about the outreach or the penalty?
The actual notice that somebody's in violation, how do they get notified? Because we might have some building owners that are just naive or ignorant and they don't read their mail, or they don't somehow see the notice somehow. We just need to make sure that it's a really legal notice process.
So I can actually throw this to Kate Townley, who is part of CDPHE, and see if they have any information they can add to that. But these building owners should be complying annually with the benchmarking program. So we will have their addresses, their contact information, their phone, and all of that information. So we will have that updated annually through the benchmarking program. But again, CDPHE will be handling that. So Kate, I'm not sure if you're listening in, if you can provide any feedback. And if Kate can't right now, the state can try to follow up with that information.
Yeah, as long as it's a real legal notice process, certified mail or what have you. And then my second question is, how is the collection of these fines handled? Is it a lien on the property? I hope so, as opposed to just pay us somehow.
Again, I'm going to defer to Kate on that. And I saw that they unmuted themselves.
Hi, I will not be able to address that personally because I don't have the subject matter expertise for that, but I can send those questions to Joshua or some other folks from the CDPHE team to see if they can respond.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Jim, those are fantastic questions. Bill, I'll go to you next.
Okay, so, let me ask, is the intent to, I agree that the fine structure is so minimal that people won't comply, but if a building is in non-compliance, does this mean that they're gonna be fined once a week, once a month for the previous year? Because they could say, hey, my building is getting better. And the problem is you don't have a year's worth of data to determine if it's better until after the year is up. So, how does this work? I can't understand it.
So I'm not quite sure if I understand your full question, Bill, but the deadline is listed in statute as June 1st of 2027 as the deadline for the 2026 benchmarking not benchmarking, but also BPS requirements. So that is in statute. That's not something we can change, unfortunately. But in this proposal, as Will mentioned, we wanted to add some teeth to this and encourage and require the building owners to comply and just not do nothing. So with this proposal, as of right now, the first violation is past that June 1st deadline. If it's 30 days after, that's the second violation. Do we want to add any more wording of like a monthly violation passing that? I see that there isn't any specific wording in this proposal around that, so I apologize. So we can add that in of each month, it will have another violation add on to it. Is that something that you're asking to add to this, or?
So, well, I mean, there's two parts to that. One is submitting benchmarking data, and the other is non-compliance with EUI target. And so let's say a building owner, you know, violated by not submitting data, but, you know, the next month they did submit data, but they're in non-compliance. So how can you tell that they're still in non-compliance a month after that?
So actually, I think I understand that there's some confusion here, and I do realize I put this in the requirements. So technically via statute, and Will, you can correct me, we have two requirements. We have the benchmarking report, and then we have the BPS. We have not actually specified, we have specified that, you know, for the adjusted compliance and renewables, that documentation to the Energy Office is required. But we have not laid out anything official of like a certain report to include with the BPS submission. So that is why in this proposal, I just included the benchmarking report. So the benchmarking side is kind of set in statute. That program is up and running. So we can change that wording here of the BPS report by that deadline, because the state will be accepting and have its own non-compliance for the benchmarking program. And so I think maybe we need to take that wording out and just think about it from the BPS side. If building owners have made renovations or retrofits and they are trying to meet their site UI target, we should be able to see that through the benchmarking data. And so that's why I had included that. But we can change the wording around that, because I can see that being confusing about compliance with benchmarking, compliance with BPS.
And I think just to add to Bill's point, because I'm seeing the same thing. If the benchmarking report is for 2026, that data is not going to change months after, after the compliance deadline. So if somebody is submitting for the BPS, do they have the opportunity to generate that site EUI using more recent data from their maybe more recent upgrades? If they do, like if they have a fine, they make an upgrade that month, how do then they show that that EUI has updated if they're not producing a new benchmarking report?
That is something that they can update their benchmarking report or have a new benchmarking report that they can download. But that's actually something that we can actually write into this of if they miss that first, they have that first violation, but then throughout June, they work with the Energy Office and submit it by July 1st. Maybe they have that first violation fine, but then we actually have their site UI target and that second violation doesn't need to kick in. So maybe we should actually add some wording around that, and we're open to suggestions from the task force.
Yeah, Bill, anything to add? If not, I'll go on to Karen here.
Well, I guess, so let's say that they did not comply with EUI targets, okay? They submitted a report, didn't comply. How can you tell a month later if they do? Because you don't have a year's worth of data, you have a month worth of data. And building energy use is highly variable through the year. And so you need a full year to determine if you comply or not.
Yes, and something I think, I'm not quite sure if we're going to make a vote on this by our actually deadline right now, but we can add some wording in around that. But this is the 2026 BPS target. So the target has to have been met by December 31st of 2026, and that's how we're reading the statute. So I'll defer to Will to make sure I'm reading that correctly, that to meet their targets and to be deemed in compliance, they have 6 months to submit their report or documentation of renewables or whatnot. But that energy data usage, at least on the benchmarking side, is by December 31st of 2026. And so with the BPS, if they've made changes, I would assume, Will, it'd be from 2023 to 2026. So Will, do you have any additions to add here?
Will, before you jump in, if I may, I think that we may need to take this back and think about, and I think that this may be part of just a confusion in the language. You know, there are two separate things going on here. There's a failure to actually file what needs to be filed, and there in Bill's second example, you know, a building owner who actually files what needs to be filed, but then the target hasn't been met. And so I think it's clear in the instance of the first kind of thing that, you know, we'll know when they actually do file the report. And so we can think about the assessment of fines under those types of issues in one way, but we may need to think about the second set of circumstances where somebody has actually provided a report, hasn't met the target, and then comes back and says, you know, well, look, I did the work, now I'm going to meet the target. And so let us think about what that second piece looks like in civil penalties under the second piece, because Bill, I see the point of the concern and the complication there. I think that is quite distinct from just a building owner who doesn't provide the report at all. So this seems to apply to the first quite simply, and the second not quite so well, perhaps. So we'll take that back. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. And Karen, and then I'll go to Katrina.
And I'll just try to be quick, but we had provisions for, I forgot what we called them, variances or adjustments or whatever. So I just wanted to make sure that that's, you know, very clear that if they have applied for one, or there's a way to apply for one if they figured out too late. Maybe, you know, maybe they still get assessed, but I just wanted addressed. And then the other thing that we have spent a lot of time on is the under-resourced building owners. So I just want to make sure Katrina's point is well made, that you were supposed to know the law, but with 160 languages spoken in the city of Aurora, I still just want to make sure that under-resourced or there's something in there, a pathway to compliance if they really didn't get the message. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Karen. Katrina.
Yeah, thank you so much. So just a couple of thoughts. I would love to see this broken out. I think this is the direction you were already going, into civil penalties for benchmarking, and then those for the building performance requirements. I think for benchmarking, the amounts here may be a bit too high. Just benchmarking a building is not a very expensive proposition. And our Energize Denver task force had always recommended that Denver set the penalty just a bit higher than the cost of compliance. Our benchmarking penalty is just $2,000 for any given year's violation. And then we're always willing to waive that if someone comes around and does benchmark their building. And so I don't know if the task force would like that sort of formulation for benchmarking. And then for building performance, just a few notes. I do think it's important that we look at that separately. I'd encourage Colorado Energy Office to consider looking at what a schedule might be over time, and how if a building goes on an alternate compliance plan or through an alternate compliance option, then perhaps that's when sort of the monthly fines stop accruing, because they now have a plan in place. So their compliance deadline can shift. And our team has been working through a lot of the details on that. The last thing I want to note is that I think the fines should likely vary by the size of the building and the amount that the building needs to save, because the cost of compliance varies vastly. If it's a 100,000 square foot building that needs to save 4%, that's a very different thing than a 500,000 square foot building that needs to cut energy use by 50%. So I think there also may need to be some amount of kind of delineation of fines by size and by amount that has to be saved, or perhaps it's just by BTUs that have to be saved. Our fine structure is set up differently, but we also have some data, the last thing I'll flag, that just might be useful to help set appropriate fine amounts, because we've done an analysis of sort of what is the general cost of compliance. And I'll note that for most buildings, it is more than $57,000, but that was just a 1-year fine. So maybe it adds up to enough over time. And again, it depends a lot on the size of the building and the amount that they have to save. Washington, D.C. created bins for sort of different amounts that buildings had to save and what the penalties would be. So that would be another possible model.
Thank you for all that feedback, Katrina. And I'm going to throw it back to Kim in a minute because I know we're running low on time. CEO will take this and restructure this proposal a bit. So thank you for all this feedback. And I'll also mention that the benchmarking fees are not these. These are different. They're set in statute. And the AQCC will do their own deciding around that. So we can provide some of that background information, but these fines are just for the BPS. It's a different structure. But we'll take all of this feedback. If you haven't been able to talk, please put it in the comments or email it to us, and we'll include it as we're reworking this proposal. Kim?
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. And yep, so we're gonna just, because we have about 4 minutes left, we're gonna, and I just hit start from the beginning, so I apologize. Nobody look, they don't make you guys sick, run through this. So we're just gonna wrap up with a couple of reminders. And just to note, we did have these proposals around BPS beyond 2030. And so we'll make sure that we touch on this at our next meeting. Yeah, Christine and Paula, thanks for your hands. If you guys want to throw your comments in the chat, that'd be great. So just some reminders. So we have the public engagement survey live, and through discussions with the CEO this week, we decided to keep that survey live until we wrap up all of our public engagement meetings. So the survey will stay live until July 22nd, which is the Friday following our last public engagement meeting. That way, if there are questions or comments that don't get heard or answered during those public meetings, folks have an opportunity to share that feedback via the survey. So that's one quick update on that end. We have had about 85 survey responses so far. So thanks for all of you who have been able to send out the survey and the information to your networks. And if you guys can continue that push, that'd be greatly appreciated. And then just a reminder, we have three public meetings are coming up on July 12th, July 14th, and July 20th. Those will all be virtual meetings. You all are not required to attend, but if you'd like to attend those public meetings, please register for those. And then as far as our next meetings, we'll have our 11th meeting at the end of July, July 27th. And that's where we'll wrap up our discussion on these proposals and then talk about all of the public feedback that we got from the public meetings and the public survey. And then on September 14th, we'll have our 12th and final task force meeting where we will be reviewing the final draft of the recommendations. So I think that's all we've got for you guys today. So just want to say thank you all for your time, your really thoughtful feedback and engagement. I thought the conversation today was fantastic, as it always is. And so it's great to see you guys and hear from you. We'll take all your feedback and incorporate what we can into the language for these proposals. And then we can we'll circle up offline with the CEO to understand what we want to do with demand flexibility moving forward. So thanks again, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.